Good afternoon. I'm Jim Dawson, Vice President, Compliance Solutions at CoreData. I have over 30 years of pharmaceutical and biotech experience with approximately 15 years of compliance as a compliance officer. If you've tuned into simplifying complex monitoring requirements, you're in the right place. So, want to welcome you to CoreData's second in a three-part webinar series designed to assist you in understanding and simplifying what appears to be the complex world of compliance monitoring. As you know, all companies are required to do some level of monitoring, whether you're a large, medium, or small company. Those with CIAs and those that don't still have to do monitoring. The level of monitoring, the complexity of monitoring varies depending on each company's situation. The key to compliance monitoring is don't overcomplicate it. Use existing processes, systems, and data, and monitor the right things the right way for the right reasons. In other words, make monitoring as simple as possible while maintaining effectiveness. In the first seminar, we looked at compliance monitoring from a government and legal perspective, providing an overview of what an effective compliance program looks like from a government perspective, focusing mainly on monitoring. We also took a look at the deficiencies in monitoring programs, along with recommendations for companies wanting to enhance their monitoring. The webinar pointed out the importance of data analytics as a critical component of any monitoring program, recommending that when using data analytics, you need to be thoughtful in what you select for analysis. Be thoughtful about the data you collect and retain pursuant to an established retention policy. Don't look at the data without having a reasonable basis to believe the exercise will be fruitful. Consider privilege before looking. Don't kid yourself about what you are seeing. Don't look and then fail to act on what you find. And don't look and act, but fail to document what you did. All are very good recommendations coming out of the first seminar. As a compliance officer, I have found some of the most difficult questions I've had to answer were, how do you know the compliance program is working? Is it going to prevent a government investigation? Are you correctly identifying high risk activities and individuals, and how do you know? Have you taken the appropriate corrective actions, and are they working? How are you measuring your compliance program success? Do you have any benchmarks? Without an effective compliance monitoring program that includes data analytics, you cannot answer these questions with confidence. We try the best we can with the resources we have available, but therefore we need to constantly rethink and improve our approach to monitoring and data analytics. Today, we continue the process to help rethink your monitoring approach. The goal is to help you develop an effective and efficient monitoring program. Let's take the complex and make it simple. Today's webinar is designed to look at compliance monitoring from the perspective of how monitoring and data analytics is done by compliance professionals today. We're going to look at what an effective compliance program looks like with a focus on monitoring, a look at some of the deficiencies in company monitoring programs, recommendations for companies wanting to enhance their monitoring programs. To assist us in accomplishing this today, we are fortunate to have Sean Day, Director, Sun Pharmaceuticals. Sean is a versatile compliance leader with broad international experience in providing commercial and compliance guidance to global companies in the pharmaceutical, medical device, clinical research, energy, electronics, and management services. Through sheer expertise and an optimal level of compliance knowledge and understanding, Sean has led several compliance teams to success, built relationships in a global environment, and worked collaboratively across all levels of international organizations with unquestionable integrity. He also serves as a global coordinator for healthcare in the privacy, data security, and information law practice. Importantly, to me is that Sean has a strong audit and monitoring background and has a unique way of looking at corporate risk and monitoring needs and developing the appropriate solutions. I am pleased to have Sean joining us today. I believe you are in for a insightful, thought-provoking, and solutions-oriented presentation. At the end of Sean's presentation, we will be answering your questions. So please send those questions in so we can address them. Sean, I leave the rest of the presentation to you. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction. Can you hear me? Make sure I have unmuted myself here.
You have totally unmuted yourself.
Perfect. And I will apologize in advance for the construction sounds that may be emanating from downstairs. They're painters trying to move my downstairs renovation along. Doors are closed and they know that I'm presenting, so hopefully the noise is at a minimum. And before we get started, I would not be doing my job as a former in-house counsel without giving the obligatory disclaimers. I'm here on a personal base as an individual, not representing a son, and all the things that I'm speaking about today are based upon my career experiences, not on behalf of Sun or Tera Pharmaceuticals in any official capacity. And so, and anything that I might mention about corporate integrity agreements that Sun or Tera are involved in are all publicly available. So feel free to Google them and see some of the things that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Also, I am a licensed attorney, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Please don't take anything that I'm saying today as attorney or any kind of legal advice. There's no attorney-client privilege through this webinar. Without further ado, let's move to the first slide here. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to turn my camera off here. Tend to talk with my hands a little bit. So one of the very few things I remember from undergraduate philosophy class was a quote from Sun Tzu, and it's kind of always stuck with me, and a lot of things that I've come across in my career. And the quote is on the screen there: "Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out its victory in relation to the foe whom he's facing." And in a nutshell, water finds its level. That is something that's really stuck with me, and I've always tried to use that as kind of my foundation, pretty much with anything that I do within compliance. And so, you know, let's kind of parse through this. You know, water, I think that represents our compliance program. The ground, it varies depending on the situation that you're dealing with. It could be a variety of things. It could be the jurisdiction you're in and the different types of laws that are promulgated from those jurisdictions. Depends on what your industry is. Depends on what your therapeutic areas are, your products. It could even be as specific as the business units that are within your organization. And so the ground can definitely mean a lot of different things. And then, of course, we're the soldiers. It's your chief compliance officers, it's your head of monitoring, it's your team of compliance professionals, and the vendors that you might work with. We can go to the next slide. And so we're trying to answer this question of what makes an effective and efficient compliance program. And so if we're thinking about our compliance program as water finding its level, we're fighting a foe, because we're the soldiers, but well, who is our foe? Well, it's situational and circumstantial. I think first and foremost, it's always unmanaged and unmitigated risk. That was what my motivation was to becoming a lawyer, to getting into compliance, was, you know, to keeping people or keeping organizations out of litigation. At that point, you're already in trouble. You want to be proactive, get out in front of some of these things. And so that's kind of, you know, unmanaged and unmitigated risk has kind of been the wind in my sails, so to speak, that's driven my career. But besides that unmanaged and unmitigated risk, you've got the government expectations. There's laws, there's the fraud alerts we get, there's corporate integrity agreements, there's all kinds of expectations that are sometimes clear, most of the times, unfortunately, not so clear. Then on the other side of that, you've got your business's expectations. You got to manage those. They have their needs. And then I think finally, the last foe that we're always having to battle is lack of resources. And it could be money, it could be people, it could be technology. It all varies. It's situational and circumstantial. But I think these 4 areas that I just covered, I think are kind of the big buckets that the foe that we're up against as we're trying to find our level with our water. That's what we're dealing with. Okay, next slide. All right, so what does effective mean? You know, I'm reminded of a riddle that goes something along the lines of, how do you keep someone in suspense? I'll tell you tomorrow. And I attributed that to Uncle Sam. It's a little bit of sarcasm, but my point here that I'm trying to make is, you know, we always wait with bated breath for the next fraud alert or the next guidelines, and there's always a flurry of activity from consulting firms and everybody pushing out white papers, and we're all so eager. I know I'm eager to read what's the new take on things, and I'm always left with this riddle in my mind of I'm in suspense and I feel like I'm just being told wait till tomorrow, and so that's not really helpful. But at a minimum, you know, success, you know, for me at least, its success is producing the desired or intended result. And so for a compliance program, you know, what is the desired or intended result? Well, again, it depends on who you ask. If you're asking the government, you know, they want you to abide by laws. They don't want you to defraud or waste taxpayer dollars. If you think about some of the laws that are very important to us, those that are in international rules, you're dealing probably with FCPA. Well, the FCPA, that's been around since the 70s, and that came out of Watergate, oddly enough. And then if you're in false claims, you know, dealing with US matters, you're working with the False Claim Act. Well, that came out of the Civil War and people bilking the government with building the war machine for the Civil War. And so these things have been around for quite a while, but the general premise is the same. We want you to abide by laws and don't waste our taxpayer money. Moving along to the business, you know, for an effective compliance program, they want essentially for you to stay out of their way, execute strategy, meet sales targets. It's pretty simple. Put them in, and my personal perspective is always trying to figure out a way to put them in a position to be successful and not thinking about anything other than their strategy and their targets, and that all the compliance stuff is sort of floating in and around them. That's at least the goal. And then from a compliance perspective, most of us participating in this today are from a compliance perspective. I think for the compliance perspective, the ultimate goal of being effective is when your employees take ownership of a positive compliance culture. They anticipate the risks. They can sort, you know, hopefully get to a point where they can self-help with your policies and procedures. And then if they're not sure, they can always come to compliance. But I think that ultimately is where we want to be, is where we have employees taking ownership of that positive compliance culture. Okay, next slide. All right, so where to start? We have a tremendous amount of discretion in defining success, and then that kind of is our dilemma, is you know, what path do we need to follow in order to get to that success? If you don't know where you want to go, any path will get you there. And so I think the first thing to always remember, and I kind of alluded to this in the previous slide, is first remember that the organization and its employees own compliance. We are more or less custodians of of the compliance infrastructure, which is the policies, the procedures, the technology we might use, the training, all of those things. We're custodians of that. But ultimately, the employees own own compliance. And so the next step that I would recommend, and this is sort of my thinking too, is there's the compliance maturity model that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. If you're not familiar with it, just Google compliance maturity model. You'll get a hit of multiple consulting firms with their different variations of it. But essentially what it is you start with very immature, and there's various points along the way where you're starting to put things into place, and you get a little bit more mature, you become established, and then you become almost like leading edge. I forget exactly what some of those terms are that they use, but essentially it's a curve where you start immature and eventually you get to a level of maturity, which is the third step, which is identifying a level of maturation that can be reasonably attained. So what do I mean by that? I think within every organization, you have your compliance group, and then you have all of the other back office kind of support functions, legal, procurement, finance, comm ops, sales ops, HR. Those organizations or those groups within an organization partner with a compliance group. Then you have the business units, the commercial side of things. And no matter how great you've built up your internal department infrastructure, you can have all the bells and whistles, all the greatest technology, you're constrained by the effectiveness of the departments around you, how mature they've become, how disciplined they are. Those are constraints on the ability for compliance to reach higher levels of maturation. And so you sort of have to, a quote that I kind of live by is, control everything that you can control and manage everything else. And the goal is obviously to control as much as you possibly can, but I think we all recognize that we control a lot more within our departments, and the rest of it we have to manage. And I think as you try to move along that maturation curve, the things that you're in control of actually become less, and the more you need to manage. And so it's a full team effort to get you kind of up that steeper part of the maturation curve. I think that's a really important step along the way, because if you don't figure out where you're at on that curve and where you think you can reasonably get to, I think you're going to set yourself up for a lot of frustration. And so once you've kind of defined where you think you can reasonably get with the current state of all the departments around you, define what must be done to reach that next stage. It could be, revamping policies. It could be revamping training. It could be introducing new technology, partnering with the other departments and leveraging some of the work that they're doing. There's lots of different ways to help figure out what must be done to reach the next stage. But that's where a lot of the hard work comes into, is figuring out what you can actually reasonably attain and what you must do to reach that next stage. And then once you've done that, it's rinse and repeat. You execute, you evaluate, and you repeat. You keep, the idea of continuous progress is essentially what we're trying to say here. Okay, next slide. So we started off with the question of what is an effective compliance program. Well, it's a balancing act. You're trying to get to a point where you're operating proactively for the level of your program's maturity in order to foster a culture of compliance. And fostering is a balancing act. If you come on too strong, people will be defiant. You won't get any buy-in. If you come on too weak, people will be dismissive of you, and you won't get any buy-in. And so, it's definitely a balancing act, and it's always kind of teetering back and forth. But within that, you have various functions within the compliance department, within the program itself, and some are going to be more mature than others, and that's okay. You know, trying to keep them all in lockstep. If you have an army of compliance professionals, that may be more easily said than maybe more easily attained than if you have a small staff that's wearing multiple hats, trying to keep all things moving along in parallel. Probably going to end up with some different levels of maturity, and that's okay. That's okay. Remember, continuous improvement, I think, is something we always kind of keep in the back of our mind. Okay, next slide. All right, so what are the company's expectations for effective internal controls? Now, so internal controls is definitely an internal audit term. I was introduced to internal audit in a very unorthodox fashion. I was an in-house counsel first. I actually started, and how I got that introduction was I was in-house counsel for a consulting firm that did internal audit work, Sarbanes-Oxley stuff, and then come full circle, I ended up joining one of the principals at Teva in building up the compliance audit program there. And I thought he was crazy when he asked me to join, because I was a lawyer and he needed auditors, and they really wanted to have a different perspective from career auditors, CPAs, finance background people, and that he would be able to teach me all the other stuff around being an auditor. And so I got that opportunity, not a traditional path, but it was a wonderfully beneficial experience for me, because I became comfortable with internal controls. And they're important, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in a couple more slides, but the guidance that we're being given, and again, going back to the riddle, you know, the government not being so helpful in giving us clear instructions on what we should be doing and how to do it. But when you look to the sentencing guidelines, basically they're telling you to detect criminal conduct. Okay, great. That's really helpful. You go to the OIG. Well, they want you to detect criminal conduct and also reduce identified problem areas. Wow, that's even more helpful. Problem areas. Well, what are those problem areas? Well, that's where you get the fraud alerts and things like that, and they're somewhat helpful. They definitely are much more helpful than a lot of the other guidance we might get. The business, I think the business is one that's pretty clear. You know, they want they want to have processes that are reasonable, that aren't going to be cumbersome. Again, remember their goal. They want to execute on their strategy and drive sales. And so I think for monitoring, the way I look at it, it's an ongoing evaluation of the business activity taking place. Is it working as intended, and are the expected outcomes occurring? And so every year, your business units, they're coming up with their budgets, they're coming up with their go-to-market action plans, their strategies, and it's always going to be kind of moving that, you know, going back to the Sun Tzu thought of water finding its level across the ground. The business is constantly changing you know, moving the ground underneath us. Sometimes it's drastic, other times it's minor, but we should be doing an ongoing evaluation. It almost should work in parallel. In my mind, the way I handle things is to try to be in parallel as much as possible, maybe a step behind with those business unit marketing plans and strategies for the upcoming year, just to make sure that my monitoring activities for the upcoming year are going to be tailored to the new risks that might be coming out of the new strategy. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Okay, so expectations for this effective monitoring program. Identifying deviations from your policies, procedures, you know, whether they're unintentional and intentional, you know, that's what we're charged with doing. And then sometimes when we find these deviations, no matter whether they're intentional or unintentional, they're opportunities. You have when you're doing monitoring, when you're doing auditing, you sort of get into this negative, it's easy to fall into a negative mindset. And I think that is also a real big challenge for all of us professionally, is to kind of flip that around, look at the cup as being half full, and that when you do find these deviations, these are opportunities to improve your accuracy, to improve your efficiencies, and improve your effectiveness. And I think that in itself is a big way to win the hearts and minds of your business colleagues, to know that you are in it with them, you're in the trenches, and that you've identified these opportunities and you share it with them, and you work together collaboratively to improve things. And then that kind of leads to the last point here: be involved prior to, during, and after business activities take place. You are, if the commercial group is driving the car, you're sitting in the passenger seat. I got shotgun. That's kind of the motto of compliance, is getting in the front seat, riding in the passenger seat with the business units, to make sure that you're ever present there to support them. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So the areas that are expected to be monitored, and I try to keep this stuff simple. Complexity is the enemy of execution. Is a little piece of paper I have flagged on my monitors here, and so I've tried to keep this as simple as possible. We're in life sciences. What do we do in life sciences? We interact with HCPs, government officials, and third-party agents. So how do you evaluate? How do you monitor those things? Well, I think in my mind, there's the clinical side of things, and then there's the commercial side of the business, and on both sides of those, you have two things that kind of flow: money and a message. And so the money that's flowing through on the sales side, it's going through honoraria for speaker programs and consulting activities and ad boards, sponsorships, all those kind of activities. And then on the clinical side, you have your MSLs. They're out in the field with their messages. Medical affairs is also providing grants, CME activities, clinical studies. If you follow the money, you're likely to find interactions with HCPs and government officials and third-party agents. And for those that are operating in the world of FCPA, those government officials and those third-party agents, you got to follow the money. That's really the only way that you can really get at those interactions, is to follow the money, and make sure that you're monitoring things correctly. The other part of this is you have your policies and procedures. Some organizations tend to be more rules-based. Others tend to be principle-based, and a lot are probably a hybrid mix of the two. But there's always a balance that we're trying to find, with empowering the business to do what they need to do and not overthink things, but at the same time provide the proper guardrails for them to not get themselves in trouble. And that is certainly easier said than done. It's different for each organization, but finding that balance is extremely important. I subscribe more to the principle-based. I know I used to be of the mindset that I start with rules and you earn your way into having principle-based policies. I've changed that school of thought to being more of the principle-based and mixing in a bit of rule-based policies and procedures. Nobody wants to read a policy that tells them don't do this. What they ultimately want to know is, what can they do? And so I think if you could strike a healthy balance of, this is what you can do, this is our position and how we want to handle these kind of activities. And then when you are doing these activities, these are what are the things you want to look out for and the things you want to completely avoid. I think that's the way, at least the way I've seen it, a nice way of striking that balance. And then finally, you got to know what your general business strategy and goals are. Are you producing the desired or intended result? That that I think is a bit ancillary to the typical compliance risks. It's definitely outside of the box, but I think it is beneficial to the business, and we're all subject to the business's success. My salary and my bonus is contingent upon them being successful, and if I'm in the field or if I'm monitoring something and I'm seeing something that is going to hurt our profit margins or waste or anything like that, I'm going to raise my hand. It's part of being a good team player. Okay, moving to the next slide. All right, so how do we prioritize these things? We've gone through a lot of different things here. How do we prioritize? Well, one of the first things that I've never had the luxury of having a large team. I've always been wearing multiple hats, and as well as my colleagues, which is I enjoy that. And so with that though, we had to really take into consideration the total number of an activity's transactions, and in order to determine how easy or how difficult it will be to monitor those. The fewer activities you have, the easier it'll be to monitor. The more, the harder. One good example for that I'm dealing with is on the Taro side of our organization. And this is all publicly available in our corporate integrity agreement that Taro signed back in 2021 for alleged price fixing. One of the things that we're required to look at is our contract process. We have a required to sample so many and monitor them. And so when you're looking at them, it's like, okay, well, there's a lot of activities in the generics business. There's lots of customers, lots of contracts. And the thing that's always constantly changing in the generics industry is the prices. But what doesn't change a lot, you're probably not adding on new customers a tremendous amount. And so one of the easier things to monitor is new customer contracts. You're not getting a lot of them. The volume is just smaller, and you may be able to monitor every single one of them to ensure compliance with your policies. Now, if you're trying to go with the price changing side of things, well, generics industry, you're changing prices. Most of the time you're lowering the prices, but still that's driving volume. It's much harder to do. You certainly can't monitor all the activities, so you're going to have to randomly sample or do some risk-based sampling. But certainly taking the number of activities that are driving the transactions, certainly a big kind of first step. Then there's the cost benefit of monitoring. You have your budget, your staffing, and other resources. Some of it, is it going to be a value add? A good example is manual email review. Not every organization has the luxury of having, a relativity or some of these softwares or packages that allow you to put in the key terms and kind of put it in motion and kind of automatically do this work for you. A lot of time we're having to do this stuff manually, and that takes a lot of time and effort. And for what? What do you actually get out of it? Occasionally you might find some interesting things, but I think in the big picture, it's a lot of work for very little return. So I think those are the cost benefits, kind of an example of the cost benefit analysis that you would have to do when choosing what to and what not to monitor. Kind of piggybacking on the first two topics here, or the first two areas, is the ease of monitoring. Can technology be leveraged? Well, with an email review, certainly you can definitely use technology there to get that work done in a much more efficient manner. But also when you're monitoring, depending on what you're monitoring, you have to make sure that your data is reliable, email aside. But if you're looking at a variety of data inputs, that's always a challenge. Right now, that's kind of the exercise I'm going through, is in ensuring that data is reliable for me to then decide what to monitor, how often to monitor, and it's a challenge. That's part of working with the other business units, understanding their processes, and then A lot of the soft skills come into play there as you're trying to convince, win hearts and minds, and trying to change maybe their way of doing business and their processes. And then you also have your natural constraints. I just got back this morning from a ride along in Atlanta. Yesterday, I rode along with a rep. There was no other work getting done. Answered a couple emails during breaks, but that's a natural constraint. If you have one person that's doing ride-alongs, they're cut off from doing pretty much anything else. So you have those natural constraints. Another thing to consider is the risk of non-compliance. There's serious consequences. If you've got something that's going to be a serious consequence, you're more likely to want to be on the front end doing pre-activity monitoring. If something that has a higher likelihood of being non-compliant, you probably want to monitor more all around, early, pre, during, and post. And that's part of your risk assessment, where you would be able to kind of do a SWOT analysis and have an idea of where things kind of fall in that, and kind of go from there in as far as prioritizing where you want to focus your energies. You also have to take into consideration people's motivation to be non-compliant. When I wrote this slide up, the thought that was in my head was reading the Biogen case, and what they were struggling with as far as their portfolio, and trying to, that patent cliff's coming, you've got competitors coming, trying to keep that cash flow coming in for some of your legacy products, and at the same time you've got all your eggs in a lot of eggs in one basket of a potential product coming down the pipeline, and on top of that, aggressive incentive comp goals. And so if you've read any of the details of that case, you can kind of see, like, wow, imagine it's amazing that they didn't get caught sooner, or someone blew the whistle on them sooner, because of the stuff that was going on. It was pretty aggressive. And so it was compensation goals, the aging portfolio, tone from the top, from the business units, regions, territories. There's all kinds of different motivations that are going on, and sometimes they all kind of coincide at one time and make for a real big mess. But when I was putting that slide together, the Biogen, if you're not familiar with it, give it a look over. There's a lot of good takeaways from that recent settlement. And then finally, product life cycle. I think this is really, really important, because this really shows how your compliance risk is going to evolve. If you're at a small company with maybe one product that's not even been approved yet for commercialization, well, your risk is going to be very different than somebody with a mature portfolio across many different therapeutic areas. And so as you're moving through your product's life cycle, you could almost have an audit and monitoring plan for, if you're small enough, tailoring it to a product. Because if they're on a different part of the life cycle, you're going to have different needs. If you're in the development phase, you're going to want to know who's talking about what. You don't have anybody out in the field talking. You're not doing ride-alongs. You're not monitoring speaker programs. So what are you monitoring? Well, it's the clinical stuff. It's the medical affairs at the congresses. What's being said out there. Maybe a good idea to look at emails then. Once your product is introduced, though, the game changes a bit. Now you've got sales. They're out in the field. Maybe you've got speaker programs starting. Are you first to market? Are you last to market? Depending on where you fall in that pecking order is going to change your pressures, your perspective, your incentives for your sales reps. Maybe the corners that they would cut to kind of eat into someone that got to market first or second ahead of you. So that's an important consideration. Then you move into these like growth, maturity phases. The market's kind of established. you kind of slicing away 1%, 2% here off of each other's market share. It's this kind of tug of war going back and forth. It's probably the one time that your monitoring is probably the most static. It's probably not evolving or changing as frequently if your product is, in this growth and maturity phase. But then that only lasts for so long, because then it's on the decline. You're heading towards your patent cliff. You got generic competition coming. That changes the landscape, puts a lot of different pressure. If you've got nothing coming down the pipe that has any potential, people are getting really desperate. Those things really changes the dynamic that your monitoring program needs to adjust and reprioritize. Okay, moving to the next slide. I'm checking the time here. We got about 20 minutes left, so we're making good time here. So some examples of where monitoring can identify a problem. We were talking about a new launch of a product. What if you have, I've seen a situation where a new product was launched, and I remember seeing the label and seeing that it said that we had no contraindications, but that we were also studied as a monotherapy. And it's kind of like, wow, like that almost feels like a trap. When you get out there and you start promoting and you get a certain question, depending on your therapeutic area, you're probably, oncology is a good example. Everything's used in combination. Dermatology, everything's used in combination. And so it would almost be silly not to anticipate that your rep is going to get a question about, hey, can I use this product in combination with X? Well, if you're not done the proper training, you might have an answer where they say, no, we don't have any contraindications. Well, factually not incorrect. However, it's a bit of a half truth. The truth is that we don't have any contraindications because we only studied it as a monotherapy. And so, getting out in the field, doing a ride along, seeing that, if you're launching a new product, people are gung ho, people are out there, it's a different risk profile. And so you want to hear the strategy, you want to hear how it's being executed. Is it meeting its objectives, or are things coming up that you didn't anticipate? And so if you're out there early, you can catch that and get back to your marketing team and like, hey, rally the troops. We got to get together. We got to put together a tailored reactive response to these questions, train up everybody, make sure that they know how to respond to a question like that, stay on label, protect patients, and then it may drive some data for your medical affairs to consider maybe doing some additional studies or even supporting some investigator-sponsored studies. Moving on here to data related to policy and training consumption. Do you tend to get more questions about a certain policy position? Do your training records indicate a topic where people might be struggling? I think these are certainly indicative of maybe, these are symptoms of maybe something that's going on in the field that you might not be aware of. And so that's also why it's important to be out in the field, being being at the business unit meetings, being at the POAs and fast starts and sales meetings, to kind of connect the dots with some of these questions you've been getting and why you may be getting them, what's driving that stuff. It always seems, and I know you guys are probably nodding your head, that there are these waves. I recently had a wave where people were asking about book clubs, and it's like, well, where is this coming from? This is not something that's been really something that's been prevalent for a long time. But why is this coming up? Well, it turns out a lot of people at their prior organizations, that's what they did. We had a bunch of new hires, and that was a question that was coming up. And so, you see that, you make sure your policies are addressing those type of questions. Maybe it's not clear. Maybe revisiting your initial sales training. Some of these, it gives you insight into what maybe your next action item might be. Third-party data. This is a big one. They're only going to collect what you ask them to collect, and then they're going to charge you for it. And so striking the balance with what kind of data they collect and what you're willing to pay for it, I think it's really imperative upon us to, there's the obvious ones. When you're hiring a new speaker bureau vendor, of course, compliance is going to be, at the table, helping with those discussions and maybe even chipping in on some of the costs to collect some of that data. But what about your medical writers? What about some of these other vendors that you're working with? They're collecting data. Certainly, any transfers of value that take place, they're collecting that. But what other data may they be collecting that may be beneficial to you or could be harmful to you? They could be doing analysis that could be problematic, which leads to something that tends to always be problematic, which is hospitality data. This is a classic area that we monitor, but it's also a classic area where we can make ourselves look silly by jumping to conclusions. But I think an example is, we're supposed to be having meals, but they're supposed to be infrequent, secondary to the message, and within limits that you've set, and all those good things. But you also, your group is also, you're in medical device. And so how do you discern whether this is an actual sales call where they're, it's a lunch and learn, where they're actually teaching and educating, or perhaps it's a callback because there's some technical difficulties and they're trying to work through this new machine, this new medical device that they're working with. If you're just sitting there looking at the data, you might realize that, oh, well, all of our salespeople are just going back and just giving too frequent of meals. Now, it turns out you actually have an issue with your medical device where everybody's having to go back and help troubleshoot a particular issue. And because everybody is kind of, it's a decentralized problem with reps in all these different markets, they're not talking to each other. You may be able to detect a problem that they collectively wouldn't be able to find much later on. Some of these other ones here on the right side of the screen, hotline data, always a very good area to monitor. And by monitor, I'm more or less saying keeping tabs on what's going through the hotline and the types of investigations that are going on, and talking with your investigation team, not necessarily to understand who is under investigation, but are there people that are constantly coming up in the conversations when you're doing their interviews? Are there certain regions? Are there certain business units or a certain group of individuals within a territory that tend to always be coming up in these interviews? Something that you might want to consider looking into. Sales data as well. Always love looking at sales data. The underperformers, they feel pressure. They don't want to get laid off, so they're looking to increase their sales. Then you flip it on the other end. You've got your superstar. Well, why is this superstar always 300% over target? And they do it every year. And then those in the middle. Why are these people, up and down? There could be reasons for it. I think it's, you're trying to identify areas to monitor effectively. These are things that can give you a bit of insight into identifying things that are working well, things that are not working well, and then hopefully it's just bad luck and it's just the market dynamics for that particular salesperson. Market research. This one can be tricky because sometimes the market research, when they're doing verbatims and message recalls, sometimes they could be specific to a territory, even down to a rep level, or in some instances, it's just very generic, very high level, 100,000, 300,000 foot level where you couldn't pinpoint a specific issue or pinpoint it to a particular region or a particular sales rep. So I think it's important to kind of check back with them every once in a while, the team that runs your market research. See what kind of studies are running, what kind of verbatims are out there, what's their message recall. Monitor those. You never know what you might find in some of that, the feedback that comes from the HCPs that might be part of these message recall campaigns. And then finally, sales and prescription data. You know, in the U.S., this is particularly of interest for us, though, that are in the U.S. Outside of the U.S., the prescription data, it's more at a regional or a BRIC level, so you don't necessarily have the ability to pinpoint things. But in the U.S., you can hone in on the specific areas. You could get it down to one location. And so, you know, a lot of organizations struggle with steering prescriptions to a particular pharmacy because they know that they, you know, especially the specialty pharmacies, some of them are really aggressive and they get a reputation for taking care of things for people. And so that word of mouth gets around. And then as you're looking at your data, you're like, wow, this is uptick in this one particular pharmacy. Why are they getting all the scripts? You know, these are things where monitoring can identify a problem. Okay, moving along to the next slide. All right, deficiencies in data analytics. Well, one of the biggest ones is non-existent or incomplete mapping. I think that's always, you know, you don't know what you don't know. The first exercise you should always do is figure out, you know, where the money's going and where the messages are going, but then those interactions are creating data. And so you may be capturing it, but it's incomplete, or it could just be garbage. That's really, really important to understand. You don't want to jump into, hey, IT, can you patch me into all these different data feeds into my Tableau so we can start spinning the data around. That's great and all, but you have no idea if, you know, the data is complete or if it's even accurate. Another thing that we have to struggle with, deficiencies that we deal with, it's too little data or too much data. I think too little data, you know, that's an easy fix. You know, you can identify your gaps and figure out ways to acquire it. Too much data, that is always a problem, trying to discern what's relevant, what's not relevant. You know, you want to try to dial down the noise as much as possible. It's definitely, there's no science to it. Although there are plenty of vendors out there that can help you, you know, sort of make sense of what data do you want to kind of filter out and what data you want to filter in. And then there's always the struggle of timeliness. If you're trying to stay proactive, but your data is not ripe for any kind of analysis for 6 months, well, for whatever it might be, that may be too late. And so trying to figure out ways to compensate for that lack of timely monitoring can always be a challenge. I know I have struggled with that in the past, and I expect I will continue to struggle with that into the future as well. I'm sure some of you are dealing with that as well. Okay, moving to the next slide. Okay, so taking some approaches to monitoring the data analytics that need to change. I think the first one here, I call it ostrich monitoring, you know, burying your head in the sand. Like, I don't see it, I don't hear it. If I don't know it, you know, conscious avoidance. If I don't know that it exists, then I'm happy. Ignorance is bliss. I think one of the things that when you get to these situations where you're tempted to go down that road, but you're kind of afraid of what that data might look like, well, pick up the phone, call your GC, call one of your attorneys, and discuss whether it makes sense to put that you know, that review, that gathering of data and that analysis, putting it under privilege. That's completely a legitimate option, and I think certainly it's certainly a better approach than just ignoring it. That's not gonna, if you do end up with a government investigation, the answer to the question of why didn't you look at it, and it's like, well, I was afraid of what I might find out. That's not going to go over well. And so that, I think that is always a natural tendency for all of us, is to, ignorance can certainly be bliss. This next one, for those of you that are big baseball fans, you're familiar with sabermetrics, but it's basically baseball's word for data analytics. Baseball is a perfect example, and also fantasy football. A lot of data. There's certain stats, hits, runs, at bats, RBIs, on base percentage, that are kind of that core foundation for doing data analytics and doing monitoring. I think that is for every organization, depending on what you're doing. I think that is a great thing to do, is develop your own internal sabermetrics. This next one, this is definitely an unorthodox one, but I recall coming across an individual that his monitoring plan was pretty weak. And I asked him, why do you do so little monitoring? And he explained how he was a former CFO, but he had read-only access to all of these different parts along the process. And so he was essentially live monitoring all the activities that were going on in the business as they were occurring. And as he got to a certain point, he could then reach out to those individuals to identify what they're doing, what's going on, and get ahead of any risk. I thought that was brilliant. The problem is, though, is that approach doesn't always work in a lot of organizations, because people can be somewhat territorial. And so I think this is almost Shangri-La as far as being able to get access to all of these different processes and systems, to get some of that read-only access and have that visibility into everything that's going on through your company. And then the final one here, testing of positives. I know that one thing that a lot of corporate integrity agreements ask you to look at is monitor your MIRF, your medical information request. Well, I don't know how effective that is, because the process is, if somebody doesn't know an answer to a question, you throw it over the fence to medical affairs. So those are people actually following process. What about the places where the MIRF data is not coming from? I think if you flip that inside out, that might be a better angle to approach than looking at the MIRF data that comes in. Okay, next slide. Coming down the home stretch here. All right, so are we on the right slide here? I thought the next slide was skill sets. Oh no, I'm sorry. Skip the slide here in my own mind. So identifying issues. Yep, this is the slide I wanted to jump to. Thank you. All right, so skill sets for individuals doing data analytics. I think the first one, common sense. A lot of times you come across things, you think it's smoke, it's great, you think you found something. All right, now what? Sometimes you got to ask the questions of, okay, play this out. How does that conversation going to play out when you have to call up that HCP that was your speaker and share, this coaching with them, or you got all this data from a particular activity. Now, what are you? Are you the T&E police? These are kind of things like you got to find a balance of what's really important and what's just going to be more of a nuisance to your peers, your colleagues in the organization. I think another area is your soft skills. The ability to persuade, solve problems, communicate, especially when you've got to get to a point with your maturity. On the maturity scale, you need to advance things, but you need to enlist the help of other departments. I think that ability to persuade and kind of bring them into the fold as far as how to solve problems, I think that is an essential skill. Differentiating between a symptom and a cause. This is something Jim and I've talked about. I've come across situations where a bunch of emails look like homemade bread, but if you dig down a little bit further, it actually turned out there was an inventory issue with core visual aids, and the reps were just compensating for it. And so, people normally get fired for that, but in that instance, we let them off with a bit of a warning. Same thing, speaker skipping slides. Well, the reason he's skipping slide is because you're having technical issues or he's showing up late. It's not because he doesn't care and is just flipping through these slides, just trying to get a paycheck and move on. You know, doing that root cause analysis is always paramount. Having a basic understanding of accounting. You know, I've listed a number of things here where can unearth a number of compliance issues that you definitely want to be monitoring. Petty cash is kind of non-existent. It's P cards now. You know, see what's in the P cards. Vendor master file. Well, there might be a one-time vendor function where all of these, it's kind of a hidden underground network of other vendors that are high risk that you didn't know were there. And then you need to, you know, we talked about jurisdictions kind of driving your risk. How are your discounts? How are your rebates? How are credits handled in your jurisdiction? Some places it's completely outlawed. And then just knowing your internal audit basics, control options, there's preventative, detective, segregation of duties, authorization, reconciliation. There's all kinds of different ways to compensate for tough things to monitor. You can build up your controls around it to sort of isolate some of these areas that are a little bit tougher to monitor. Okay, moving to the next slide. I think we're down to the last slide here. Areas to monitor, I believe. Yes. Okay. So, you know, this is, you know, trying to come up with our version of baseball sabermetrics here. I think one cool area would be if you had ability to kind of analyze, you know, with Google, you can get all that Google data about who hits on your website, what regions they're from, how long do they spend on a website. What if we could do that for our policies and seeing what kind of questions people have been trying to self-help with. If they spend a certain amount of time on certain pages, I think that would be an interesting way of monitoring some of the risk that might be presenting out there in the organization. Attrition rate, that's a huge thing. If you're training people, but then they leave after so many months and there's no legacy knowledge being shared, you're constantly, it's almost like you're digging in the sand. So I think looking at attrition rate within the overall company, within the overall, some of your business units, maybe a particular region, can help you identify some hot spots. Third parties, they're not all created equal, especially in an FCPA environment. If you have a distributor in a foreign country that is an exclusive seller, you certainly have a much better access to their books and records than you do with a distributor that's selling a basket of products. And so, you know, you almost have to have a different monitoring approach to those different types of distributors. And then some of these final areas, these are really like emerging areas or things that are kind of falling on the laps of compliance. You know, social media is definitely, it's certainly the bane of my existence. I'm an anti-social media person. I don't think anything good comes of it from a compliance perspective. But moving on, suspicious ordering monitoring with the opioid crisis, this is obviously front and center, and because there's a general lack of where it would fit naturally within an organization, it seems like it may be pushing itself into the compliance group. Same thing with price reporting. It's kind of following the same path. And then these last couple areas are really kind of within the last few years, you know, but assimilation of cryptocurrencies into mainstream use, and then ESG and sustainability programs. Those are emerging areas probably to monitor. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Okay, so in conclusion, remember Sun's guidance, Sun Tzu's guidance, you know, be like water. That's what you want your compliance program to be like. Try to remember to operate proactively for the level of your program's maturity in order to foster a culture of compliance. That's kind of the goal for our compliance program. And then as for monitoring, you know, we want to be in a position to be an ongoing evaluation of business activity taking place, actually working as intended, and if expected outcomes occur. And then kind of cap it all off, just remember complexity is the enemy of execution. Try to keep it as simple as possible. Don't overthink these things. Trust your gut. you're more likely more right than you are wrong when you come to trusting your gut with some of these things. And that's it. I think we're a few minutes over. My apologies. But do we have any questions? I think that's the next slide is the questions.
Yep. Next slide. Yep. Do we have any questions coming in? I have not seen any as yet. But one question I do have for you, Sean, as we wrap up here. You've done a great job of outlining the monitoring needs, compliance programs, and where to look and how to look. There's a lot of, you pointed us in the right direction, in my opinion, is looking at existing processes and activities that we can tap into. Mm-hmm. But as you put all this together, the data analytics piece seems to be a rate limiting piece because there's so much data you can have and you only have limited resources. How do you start looking at the data to answer some of these questions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I go back to always, what do I actually have the capability of monitoring? And how, you know, staffing is always going to be your biggest constraint, but trying to identify, I think for my personal experience, the organizations that I've historically been at, speaker programs has been the biggest spend, followed next by hospitality and then consulting honoraria. And I think that is telling in itself of, okay, well, that's going to have the bulk of my data, and then trying to sift through the data to ensure that you're looking at the things that are going to, there's friction points that your policies and procedures may create with some of the data. I know a good example is where sponsorships and grants can sometimes be consolidated. At the local level, if you're looking at it at the local level, it's fine because they're split apart. But if you're looking at it at a global level, those dollars get pulled into the same account, and so it you know, sometimes you got to split things apart, and sometimes it could be manual. And I think the data analytics could be a big help in trying to sort through, you know, if you're looking for a particular type of activity, the data analytics can help you kind of filter out all of the noise and get you to, I only want to look at grants. I want to get the sponsorships out of there. And along the way, you're finding miscoding and all kinds of other nonsense in there. And you're identifying weaknesses in maybe some of your other processes that you kind of put to the side so that you can get to the heart of the matter you're trying to monitor. But I think that is the challenge, is, you know, first identifying someone in the organization that has the skill set to be able to know where all of the data is coming from and where it is kind of residing, and then trying to get it out of wherever it resides into a workable format, and then not into a manual format. Everybody starts with Tableau, but that's a bridge to something like Core Data's service offerings. But I think that's always the challenge.
I agree. I think the other piece, the challenge I think we have to do is, as compliance professionals, step back and say, what are the areas I really need to focus on? Where are the areas of highest risk, and what data do I have in place, or what can I go look at to see if I have a problem? The challenge, in my opinion, we have is the quality of data we collect, the resources we have to truly analyze that data and get a actionable result. Which means to me is I can take that information, I can synthesize it, analyze it, and then come out with hey, this is some decisions we can make, whether we're in good shape or in bad shape, and go from there. But I think the rate limiting issue is, are we doing it manually? Are we do we have systems in place that can help us do that? And then on top of that, do we have the right skill sets to analyze and utilize that data appropriately to make actionable decisions?
Right. And if you're a small organization, you get put into, sometimes if you get a CIA where you're required to, monitor at a certain level that's more appropriate for a larger organization, your hands are really tied. And so how do you go above and beyond some of the basic fundamental type of monitoring activities you're obligated to monitor? And you have to do it 100%. There's no deviation from that, and you know that you're wasting time by not getting at these higher level value added type analysis. I think technology certainly can help supplement that while your staff is, focused on maybe more value added monitoring activities.
Sean, you came to the perfect conclusion for us in the fact that our next webinar will actually deal with exactly what you're talking about. How do we go and monitor in the future? How do we take these challenges we have with limited resources, limited skill sets, the requirements that are being put upon us that as a small company that is burdensome, so we can't really focus on the bigger issues to get to root cause. So thank you for being here today and joining us. And thank you, Sean, for an excellent presentation. If we can go to the last slide, I think you'll see we have a QR code that's in place that we have offer some what we call our value pack, which is some white papers, some blogs, and some other information that may be helpful to you as you're putting together your monitoring program or enhancing your monitoring program. So I thank you all for attending, and Sean, I really appreciate your time and expertise and wonderful presentation. So with that, have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. I think we're